Good evening. Thanks for coming out for the Humanities Festival Keynote Address by NEH Chairman Jim Leach. It's now my honor to introduce one of our key sponsors and the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at URI, Donald DeHaze.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third annual University of Rhode Island Spring Humanities Festival. And I'm very pleased that the word annual is now added to the title of this event. As many of you know, prior to the festival, the Humanities held a semester-long seminar series. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, Galen and many of his colleagues decided to sort of cluster the work of our faculty and visitors, such as Chairman Leach, who could come to our campus, into a 2 or 3 day focused cross, inter, and transdisciplinary event that highlighted the work of the humanities on the URI campus. And I think this is a wonderful concept. I've loved it from day one. I'm pleased to be a sponsor of this. And I thank all of the other sponsors, who are many, and I won't try to list them all. This festival this year is focusing on the arts and the humanities in the new economy. And I'm not quite sure what that new economy is, especially here in Rhode Island, as we're struggling to find any form of an economy. But I hope the new economy in the context of the arts and the humanities really gives consideration, thoughtful consideration, not only to economic development in the context of jobs, which I think is certainly important, and a university plays an important role in that. But when I talk about economic development in the economy, I also talk about the quality of life, and I talk about our understanding of the world and our place in the world, and I talk about the human condition and our role in contributing to that condition in positive and negative ways. And when I think about the economy, I can't help but to think about humanity. And there's a critically important role for our faculty, scholars, our students in the visual and performing arts, literature, philosophy, ethics, and beyond in understanding our place in the world. And this festival each year highlights over the course of 2 or 3 days the extraordinary work of faculty, scholars, and their students on this campus. And I'm very, very proud and pleased to be part of it. And I hope and I expect that as Anu, who's here somewhere, I'm sure, there she is right up front, takes over the reins of the center as Galen transitions out and Anu transitions in as director, we'll look forward to the 4th annual festival. I put pressure each year to make sure that I'm always 1 year ahead, to make sure there'll be another festival in the future. And Chairman Leach, it's truly a pleasure to have you on our campus to share your thoughts, your wisdom, your experience on these important topics. With that, I think I'm going to stop, because my job also is to introduce my boss, the president of the University of Rhode Island, who just hosted a wonderful dinner for the chairman and many of the faculty scholars. So I bring to the podium. But before I do that, Winnie Brownell's waving all kinds of propaganda. I'm also supposed to announce, President Dooley, forgive me, this is Winnie Brownell's fault, the former dean. I also want to announce another very, very important piece of the university, which is the Ocean State Summer Writing Conference, which will begin in late June 20th. This is the 7th annual, so you're going to have to catch up, Galen and Anu, the 7th annual Ocean State's Writing Conference. Another opportunity we have to highlight the extraordinary work of our faculty and our students. But putting that aside, I now introduce the 11th president of the University of Rhode Island, Dave Dooley.
Thank you, Don, and it's a pleasure to be here. At dinner tonight, we had a great conversations on a number of different subjects, but what I remember what we always remember was the conclusion that Bill Harley and I drew after a lengthy discussion very, very sophisticated analysis of data and a full analytical, I think, back and forth about the validity of the data and its ultimate significance, is we did conclude with a very high level of confidence that it's actually much easier to become the president of a university than it is to become a professional French horn player. So I'm really pleased to be here tonight, even though it's not nearly as difficult a job as many others. You can read Chairman Leach's biography. It's before you in the program. If you'll allow me, Mr. Chairman, I want to take a couple minutes to speak very personally about what I view as the important work that you do and the extraordinary capabilities you bring to the job. I think it's a remarkable time in America where we can have the President of the United States sign into law a budget that essentially dictates to the National Science Foundation that they should not fund research in political science, except as it pertains to national security or the economy. Now, Chairman Leach and I discussed this, and we thought that perhaps the explanation here was that Congress had concluded and the President had agreed that politics had reached such a level of perfection in the United States that it was no longer necessary to do any research. But I'm afraid that it actually has a much darker meaning than that, and that is reflected when you see governors of some of the nation's most populous states come out and say, we really don't need degrees in anthropology. If you want to major in English, you should pay a premium as opposed to majoring in something useful. And God forbid, if you want to study philosophy or religion, we really have no use for you whatsoever unless you're going to contribute in some way to the political discourse, which is now, of course, off limits as well. That's a real change, I think, in this country. Those of us in science are very familiar with the so-called Golden Fleece Awards that existed for a number of years, in which a well-known senator from Wisconsin would pick some scientific research project whose title seemed a little absurd and make fun of it on the floor of the Senate. But really, that really didn't slow the progress of science at all, because those kinds of attacks never undermine the validity of the scientific peer review process to decide what kind of research would be funded by the federal government. But I'm alarmed, frankly, or maybe not alarmed, but at least concerned that the current climate that we're in, with the economic recovery being as tortured as it is, with student debt being what it is, with the ongoing conversation about the cost of higher education being what it is, that we are in danger of losing something very precious, and that is our understanding of education and its value to a democracy, whether or not it leads directly to a job in engineering or physics or chemistry or any of the other STEM-related fields. So it's particularly an important time for the topic that Jim Leach has chosen to share with us tonight, the centrality of the humanities in a STEM-centric world. I think that is the world that we're likely going to exist in. That's the reality we have to deal with. And our job as academics, as members of the academy, as professors and administrators, students and staff of a university like the University of Rhode Island, is to find ways to make the case, to join Chairman Leach in making the case that a liberal education, that the value of philosophy and literature, religion and languages, history, sociology, economics, and God forbid, even political science, is worthy of investigation, is worthy of study, is worthy of research and scholarship, and that any country that turns its back on those disciplines is a country that will be diminished and, in fact, will be less globally competitive in many senses of that phrase. So, Chairman Leach, we're delighted with the work that you do, because you are a great champion, I believe, for this view. You have spoken eloquently about it. You have championed the humanities in a number of ways. The work that you do as the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, I think, is incalculably valuable, particularly in the climate in which we now work. And so we are delighted to have you here with us. We're delighted to offer our support to you personally and corporately for the work that you do. We want you to know that we believe very passionately in the work that you're doing. We're very delighted that you're in the position that you're in, and we're thankful, frankly, that we have your leadership federally and nationally at this time. So let me introduce to you, I think, someone who has one of the best understandings of the topic that he will speak about tonight of anyone I've ever read or heard speak, and that is Jim Leach, the chairman of the National Endowment of the Humanities.
Well, thank you, President Dooley. I'd like to begin with several historical footnotes and contemporary observations about the state of Rhode Island. All citizens understand that something is askew in American politics today. And the word Congress, for example, is not infrequently followed or preceded by the adjective dysfunctional. And there's a relevant role for ideology in the life of a society, but ideological approaches to governance that ignore competitive thought and consideration of compromise are seldom sustaining. Here, Rhode Island is a historical model in many regards for the country. This state, after all, led from the beginning of European settlement in advocating and protecting freedom of thought, particularly religious freedom of thought. Early settlers came to Rhode Island not only to escape religious intolerance in Europe, but to escape religious intolerance in Massachusetts. And we sometimes forget that 11 of the 13 original colonies established a religion in the colony itself, and the exceptions were Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. Even in Thomas Jefferson's Virginia, there was a 17th century law in the books that stipulated that a bodkin could be thrust through the tongue of anyone that didn't support the Church of England. This was a time of a great deal of coercion in American religion. Likewise, Rhode Island stood out half a century later when Claiborne Pell introduced legislation to establish the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. Likewise, Rhode Island stands out with an independent governor today, who was the son of a great friend of mine, John Chafee, who I was particularly close to because we both shared a love for the most egalitarian sport in humankind, that, of course, being wrestling. And today, the state has two very impressive senators. Jack Reed has accepted the mantle of Claiborne Pell and is now the Congress's greatest advocate for the humanities. And I'm particularly appreciative of that. This last week, Sheldon Whitehouse and I just finished writing a chapter for a book on that's going to deal with an obscure subject called regulatory capture, which only political sciences have a little bit of a feel for, but it's the danger of regulatory institutions becoming captive to those they regulate for a lot of reasons, some not exactly nefarious, but all quite difficult. And so what's interesting to me about this state is a long history and a recent history of extremely even-handed people in public life from both political parties. And I personally, and I have a little bias in this direction, think it has something to do with size. The larger the state, the less people know the candidates, and the more likely they are to have less than perfect candidates. Now, that's a personal judgment, but as I look at Robert, at thyself, Bob is a great example of a former congressman that had a wonderful reputation. And as I mentioned to him, there's only one place for a former congressman to flee to, and that's to the academy. And so thank you for joining this wonderful university. Well, my intent is to address the state of the humanities at a time when misconceived psychological cleavages are fast developing between the humanities and the STEM disciplines. And I'm particularly concerned that a potential rupture in the manner we look at education may be emerging that could affect our way of life and potentially American leadership in the world. My thesis is that the humanities and fields of inquiry related to science, technology, engineering, and math are complementary rather than competitive. Each is essential, each bolsters the other. Indeed, the humanities without STEM defines national stagnation, and STEM without the humanities spells the potential of mutual disaster. And I use the word disaster with great care. Before developing this thesis, let me briefly describe the institution which I head. The National Endowment for the Humanities is in the knowledge development and perspective sharing business. At the heart of our work is concern for recording and expanding the accumulated wisdom that humanistic studies illumine. NEH facilitates research about the past and contemporary culture and presents public programs to give citizens the expanded perspectives that history, literature, philosophy, and related studies inculcate. Our work is an analog to that of the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Many of our processes are similar. Like NSF and NIH, we ask scholars and experts in various fields to peer review proposals that are submitted. Like these two august science institutions, NEH is constructed to be an incubator rather than director of thought. We are committed to free thought, freely expressed, on the assumption that the challenge of providing perspective to issues of the day requires encouragement of a wide range of scholarly input from outside the walls of government. And I share with the President the view that political science should not be stifled, and that all societies at all time have an anti-intellectualist dimension, and it get raised in various ways and in various circumstances, and it's up to individuals here to think through whether this is one. That's a conclusion for the individual, but I raise it as something that should be considered. Unlike our scientific counterparts, our resources are vastly more limited. We're able to fund only about 1 in 7 research applications. In addition, we work closely with and provide approximately half the budgets of the humanities councils of the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 territories. These state councils, in turn, work closely with their state's academic institutions and put on over 50,000 programs a year, reaching every corner of the country and the territories over which the United States has jurisdiction. By chance, Rhode Island has one of the most exceptional state councils and is very fortunate to have a very impressive new director, Elizabeth Francis, who's with us today. All of NEH's work is hallmarked by the seeking of excellence. While our resources are decidedly constrained, we proudly note that we are the largest humanities research institution, and when coupled with state council programming, the largest humanities outreach organization in the world. Since our conception, we have facilitated over 1 billion words of scholarship, involving thousands of books, dozens of which have won top academic prizes like Pulitzer and Bancroft Awards. Likewise, the documentary films that NEH has supported, from the works of Ken Burns to 4 recent documentaries on various aspects of American civil rights struggle, are much decorated and widely viewed. Almost 10 million people, for instance, have so far seen at least one of the quartet of films documenting the history of America's struggle to advance equal rights this past year, and this figure will be multiplied over and over in years to come. Half a century ago, the English physicist and novelist C.P. Snow delivered a controversial lecture at Cambridge University called The Two Cultures, in which he lamented the gulf between scientists and a group he described as literary intellectuals. He cited several examples: scientists who had hardly read Dickens and humanists who couldn't define the second law of thermodynamics. At the risk of exaggeration, the gulf Snow depicted might be described as illiteracy matching innumeracy in the citadels of academia. But however defined, Snow held that the breakdown of communication between the sciences and the humanities hindered solutions to social problems. Assuming some legitimacy to this contention, what is the situation 5 decades later? In many ways, the science-humanities distinction is more complicated today as physics has become more math-dependent, biology and chemistry more complex, and scientific inquiries more theoretical. Nonetheless, from a methodological perspective, the technological revolution that began with the development of the transistor and thence the digital computer and the chip allows the humanities and sciences to share an increasing portion of common ground. Just as computers allow mathematical computations to be made at blinding speed, so the digitization of billions of pages of books, journals, and manuscripts and a myriad of objects enables the application of scientific methods to vast amounts of social science data. Indeed, the new research tools that STEM has brought us have spawned a new academic field called the digital humanities, which is defined by process techniques rather than an area of study. In our encouragement and financial incentivization of this field, NEH has found that digitization probes are particularly well suited for cross-disciplinary, cross-institution, and cross-border collaborations. As a consequence of the pioneering research initiated at places as diverse as Bell Labs, Princeton, the University of Illinois, Iowa State, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania, the social hallmark of our times is the emergence of a new digital class characterized less by occupation, birth, geographic location, and the science-humanities divide than by by an individual's degree of curiosity, diligence, and access to digital technology. The important division in the new communications age is thus no longer the one between science and the humanities. It is, in the first instance, the growing gulf between those who have crossed the digital divide and those who, by choice, lack of access, or capacity have not, and in the second, between those who seek information from diverse sources with an open-minded perspective and those who choose to rely on single-dimensioned purveyors of views. Since the Enlightenment, the issue of equality has been looked upon as a political ideal tied to techniques of social organization and governmental policies of the moment. But in the modern world, access to knowledge is becoming essential to advancing social equality and opportunity across the globe, as access to the ballot box has proven to be the key to advancing political rights. The question of whether a tweeting world will cause greater understanding and social integration at the community and international level or lead to greater intolerance and social splintering is yet to be resolved. What is clear is that few revolutions in history can match the democratizing consequences for individual learning of the development and spread of digital communication devices and the software capacities that fuel use of such hardware. If a wide-eyed creature sitting on the moon this last century were assigned the task of assessing what constructive happenings had occurred on Earth, that creature, who had circled our planet 24/7 for all those years, would have to conclude that the most impressive achievements of man in this period of world wars, religious and ideological conflict, clearly has been in the STEM disciplines. Conversely, these disciplines have also added to the vulnerability of humankind. After all, at the same time that the capacity to compute and correlate, to heal the sick, travel the earth, communicate to the most distant corners of civilization has leaped forward, the power to destroy and do harm has also grown exponentially. For the first time in man's existence, the capacity exists not only to wage war, but to destroy life on the planet. As Einstein so presciently warned, splitting the atom has changed everything except our way of thinking. Vulnerability is now the state of man everywhere. Civilization is jeopardized at one end by weapons of mass destruction, and at the other by terrorism with newly globalized capacities. Just as a plot was hatched against America on 9/11 from a mountainous redoubt halfway around the world, Cyber attacks may be launched from distant computer silos with the potential to wreak havoc on our economic infrastructure, everything from the electric grid to the financial system. The national security dilemma of our age is that the more advanced and open society, the more exposed it is to anarchistic acts. Man's fate has never been more interwoven with unprecedented security challenges. Optimism can only be presumed if STEM advances are coupled with greater humanistic understanding. Calculus and physics require a linkage to history and ethics. Together, STEM and the humanities flourish. Apart, each is jeopardized. Despite differences that may exist between the capacity of scientists to explore the unknown in nature and the ability of scholars in the humanities to address life's enduring questions, the sciences cannot ignore the humanities any more than the humanities can ignore what science has wrought. What may be counterintuitive to many is that the challenges in the humanities exceed those of STEM. This is the case because grasping and sharing the art of human understanding is vastly more difficult than mastering the technology embedded in smartphones and the most powerful computers. Love and hate, beauty and fear are more complex than high-speed algorithms and non-Euclidean geometry. There is every reason to honor the sciences and support investigations into the unknown, be they related to the beginnings of the universe or the extending of human life. Yet in the end, dark matter and dark energy may be easier to understand in the physical sciences than dark motives are in the social arena. The Higgs boson has been identified and perhaps by extrapolation found, but peace on Earth has not been secured. The bottom line case for humanities studies is thus a risk management one. The necessity of developing the wisdom, policies, and tools to avoid the apocalypse. Stewards of national power, and in a democracy that means all of us, have no choice except to strive to understand the human condition. Livelihoods and life itself demands attention to wide horizons. As important as controversies of the day, politics of the moment may be, they are generally surface concerns. To understand problems on the surface, it's necessary to know the depths below, the history and culture of one's own society, and that of others, even the most distant. Just as we need an infrastructure of roads and bridges, we need an infrastructure of ideas. As the legislation steered by Claiborne Pell, established in the NEH affirms, and I quote Claiborne Pell in this legislation, "The world leadership which has come to the United States cannot rest solely upon superior wealth, power, and technology, but must be solidly founded upon worldwide respect and admiration for the nation's high qualities as a leader in the realm of ideas and of the spirit." Unquote. Yet there appears to be a gathering sentiment, symbolized by recent initiatives in the political arena, that higher education should move away from an emphasis on the liberal arts to teaching discrete job skills. The assumption that jobs are the number one issue for most American families is valid. A conclusion, however, that the humanities are not central to job creation is mistaken. Indeed, such a conclusion could too easily lead to policy prescriptions that undercut American competitiveness and the national interest itself. A myth of our times is that the humanities are good for the soul but irrelevant to the pocketbook. Actually, they're central to the creation of jobs and long-term American competitiveness. It's true that many jobs, such as in the building trades, are skill-centric, but job creation itself requires an understanding of community and the world. Change and its acceleration characterize the times. With each passing year, jobs evolve, become more sophisticated. Training for one job skill may be of little assistance for another. On the other hand, studies that stimulate the imagination and nourish capacities to analyze and think outside the box suit well the challenges of change. They make coping with the unprecedented a manageable endeavor. What's needed in a world in flux is a new understanding of the meaning of the basics in education. Traditionally, the basics are about the 3 R's, which in my state of Iowa, as I might have mentioned earlier, are sometimes defined as reading, writing, and wrestling. But however defined, they are critical. Nonetheless, they're insufficient. What are also needed are studies that provide perspective on our times and foster citizen understanding of their own communities, other cultures, and the creative process. To understand and compete in the world, we need a fourth R, what for lack of a precise moniker might be described as reality, which includes not only relevant knowledge of the world near and far, but the imaginative capacity to put oneself in the shoes of others and creatively apply knowledge to discrete endeavors. Rote thinking is the hallmark of the status quo. Stimulating the imagination is the key to the future. As Einstein once observed, imagination is more important than knowledge. And his life is proof of the imaginative mind trumping skill set knowledge. In a math-based science, Einstein was never considered a first-tier mathematician, but he was an unparalleled imaginer. In pondering self-initiated thought problems, he probed the meaning of the universe. As individuals, each of us try to make sense of our odysseys through life. Our universe is small in relation not only to the solar system, but the communities in which we live. But whether we might be, we are affected by global events. Wherever we might be, we're affected by global events, whether related to the challenges of national security or the global hiring hall. In this insecure geopolitical environment, a deeper comprehension of the fourth R, reality, has never been more important. What better way is there to apply perspective to our times than to study the history of prior times? What better way is there to learn to write well than to read great literature? What better way is there to go to war in Iraq? It's extraordinary how inadequate attention to cultural issues may have cost lives and reputations as well as money. Yes, there was an intelligence failure related to misjudgments about alleged Iraqi complicity in 9/11 and the status of Iraq's nuclear and biochemical weapons capacities. But the greatest intelligence failure was our lack of understanding of the region itself. For instance, despite having gone to war in the Persian Gulf a decade earlier, Congress and executive branch policymakers understood little of the Sunni-Shia divide when 9/11 hit. Likewise, despite the French experience in Algeria and the British and Russian in Afghanistan, we had little comprehension of the depth of Islamic antipathy to foreign intervention. And despite the tactics of a Daniel Boone-style patriot named Francis Marion the Swamp Fox, who attacked the British garrisons at night during the Revolutionary War and then vanished in South Carolina swamps during the day, we had little sense for the effectiveness of asymmetric warfare. A skeptic once suggested that the humanities are little more than studies of flaws in human nature. Actually, they uplift on the one hand and warn on the other. The power of a few to commit acts of social destruction and the contrasting capacity of a few to precipitate uplifting change has grown exponentially in this last century. A race between these contrasting capacities is on. For the best of our values to prevail, Americans must awake from historical slumber. A renewed emphasis on the study of various humanities disciplines, especially history, is vital because of our unique role in the world and because academic testing tells us that the American people have more limited historical and geographic knowledge than virtually any other advanced society. To look presciently forward, we have no choice except to look carefully back. History has a circular quality. It tends to repeat, sometimes rewind. Wisdom, by contrast, is linear. A smart person, parents tell their children, learns from his or her own mistakes. A really smart person, a corollary might suggest, learns from the mistakes of others. And a sage gleans great truths from the wise as well as mistaken steps of those who came before. Every circumstance is, of course, different than any other. We don't ever walk in exactly the same way in the same physical or social environment. People and situations change. Hence, it's important to think imaginatively as well as pragmatically and historically. There are many ways to stimulate the imagination, from reading literature, studying and creating art, to reviewing history. But the linchpin that most often tie other studies together are history and storytelling, oral and written. No disciplines outside the humanities more effectively allow us to put on the shoes of others in past ages and different contemporary circumstances. St. Paul once suggested that we all look through a glass darkly. Metaphorically, Paul may have made the ultimate case for humility. While faith may be absolute, Paul suggests that man simply doesn't have the capacity to know the will of God or apply perfectly the wisdom of his apostles on earth. An analogous lack of certitude should be applied to history. There can be clarity about certain historical facts like names and dates, but the whys and wherefores of events can be elusive. It is no accident that history can be more controversial than current events. Nonetheless, despite the fog that always hovers over memory, it's clear that the deeper our understanding of the past, the greater our capacity to cope with the present and mold the future. Life of society and the individual is a continuum. History may be the story of the dead, but it never dies. It continues to shape who we are and how we think. Shelley once described poets as unacknowledged legislators. The great 19th century American poet of the common man, Walt Whitman, went further and implied their authority stretched beyond traditional political conceptions. Intoxicated with the notion that poetry could be an antidote to violence, he once wrote that his greatest dream was for an internationality of poems and poets binding the lands of the earth closer than all treaties and diplomacy. A third of the way around the world from this great academic center, Dostoevsky affirmed something similar. Beauty, he said, will save the world. A third of the way around the world in the opposite direction, Confucius suggested that when music and courtesy are better understood and appreciated, there will be no war. All of this sounds rather naive, but there are few people in the political realm who ever understood the human condition better than Shelley, Whitman, Dostoevsky, and Confucius. And I mention these great men of literature and philosophy because the thinking of man must be uplifted. Words and thought patterns matter. When pieced together in the logic of works like Mein Kampf, they may be used to instill hate and divide, or they may, as in the poetry of Shelley and Whitman, the novels of Dostoevsky, and the wisdom of Confucius, be used to reach out and unite. And these are our choices. In making these choices, care has to be taken to recognize that seldom is there only one proper path determinable by one individual, one political party, or one country. Whether a person knows a great deal or very little, caution should be taken about being certain of very much. To know a lot may be a preferable condition to knowing little, but the best and the brightest are not immune from great mistakes. Imperfect judgment characterizes the human condition, and that's why humility is such a valued character trait and why civility is such an important part of an interconnected world polity. Half a century ago, the British author Lawrence Durrell wrote a set of novels called the Alexandria Quartet. Each was a first-person narrative covering the same cluster of minor events between the two world wars in Alexandria, Egypt. An individual may wonder why read the same happening 4 different times. It ends up that while the events are the same, the stories are quite different. One person's perspective proved to be only a snapshot of reality. And the moral Durrell implicitly sets forth is that a clear picture cannot be pieced together without looking through the lens of a multiplicity of eyes and experiences. If such is the case in one town and one time frame, doesn't it take many eyes and many perspectives to develop a bare inkling of understanding of a moving kaleidoscope of events? The most meaningful discovery in a liberal arts education is that everything is related to everything else, although we may not know it at the time. Wisdom involves the tying together of threads of learning. The challenge is to discover and then correlate discoveries, the most important of which relate to perspective, to values, methods of thinking and doing, rather than facts. The insights provided by humanities disciplines and the judgmental capacity to think broadly and correlate cogently, which they inculcate, are not dismissible options for society. They help lessen the likelihood of mistake-making in public policy as well as private life. They revitalize the American spirit and rev up our productive engine. They inspire leadership and make citizenship a proud responsibility. In Western Europe, there's been a trend among intellectuals over the past decade to make unflattering analogies between American leaders and figures in Greek tragedies. In China, the fashion is to reference Roman history rather than Greek drama and place America's role in the world in the twilight side of the rise and fall of civilizations. By perspective, it took several centuries for Pax Romana to unravel, several generations for Athenian culture to fall from its 5th century BC pinnacle, and only a couple of decades for two of the most advanced cultures in history to become captive to fascist and communist dogma. These monumental shifts stand as forewarnings for all people in all societies. At the moment, America leads the world in almost every academic field, but a crisis is looming in the humanities as the term research has increasingly come to connote laboratories with little priority given to the perspectives that can be gleaned from libraries. Let me conclude by noting something that is instructive to consider, and that is the what-ifs in the life of a nation. What if there had been no Vietnam War, no intervention in Iraq, no maintenance of troops in Saudi Arabia in the wake of the first Gulf War, the presence of which was the cause célèbre of the al-Qaeda plotters who struck the Pentagon and World Trade Center on September 11, 2001? Would America today have a stronger economy, more respectable stature in the world? Would there be more security at home and less chance of anti-American hostility around the world? We, of course, have no choice but to plug ahead with policy options constrained by contemporary events. But of the many lessons emerging from this decade of strife, one surely is that cultural considerations matter, that resources provided to humanities research and outreach programs, and most significantly, curricula in colleges and universities are compelling social investments. Which brings me to the final what if. What if society allows humanities studies to fade in significance? Absent attention to humanities discipline, is it not likely that America's capacity to lead the world and manage our own institutions of government and commerce will diminish? To fail to study history, to refuse to derive lessons from the nature of man and the human condition resplendent in literature, and to decline to think through the philosophical and ethical quandaries of the day are to imprison our thoughts in the here and now. Inevitably, we would magnify the misjudgment of our contemporaries, shutting ourselves off from the wisdom and likewise the mistakes of others in the near and ancient past. We discount the power of the humanities at great cost and greater peril. Thank you. I will. Well, thank you very much. I will try to address any questions if you have them. If they're too difficult, I'll make the president come back. Yes.
So I would imagine that to a certain degree, you're talking to people who are humanists. That may be a few scientists. Can we actually see who's in science here? Our president. Besides the president and provost, of course. Besides the president and provost, is there anybody? One, two. So to a certain degree, we were talking to people who are obviously humanists. And I'm wondering, what do we have to do as academics in the humanities in order to make our message heard? That if we were to convey your message, which you so eloquently, what do we need to do?
Fair enough. But first, let me say your problem is not scientists. I have never met, and I've been in every state in the country in the last year and a half, I've never met a scientist who didn't support the humanities. And I challenge any of you to find one. What we're finding is that there is a political something afloat out there that is very awkward. And this is a political set of issues. And it's all about priorities. And I support budgets that, as a public official, I'm obligated to support the president's budget. But let me give you an example. If I were to suggest that the humanities not receive the same amount of research as STEM, what percentage would you think? Would it be 30%, 20%, 10%, 5%, 1%? And if it were 1%, it would be a 5 to 10-fold increase over what is now given. And that's a very interesting thought. And that's just contrasting the NEH research budget with a combination of NSF and NIH. Actually, there are many other STEM budgets, DOD, and intelligence agency that we may not know exactly how it spends money, but this is a very extraordinary phenomenon that we're in. And then I think it's interesting. I talk about it's important to learn wise things we've done. I think the most underestimated president of the 20th century is Dwight David Eisenhower. And Ike not only refused to engage in wars that he was pressured into, he stopped a war in Korea, refused to enter Central Europe, partly on logistic grounds. You don't take on the Soviet bear next to the Soviet state. A lot of people wanted to invade China. Surprisingly, more people pressed Eisenhower to be aggressive than George W. Bush. I like to joke in the year 2000, there were less than 300 or 400 neocons in the world, and yet they came to control American policy. But Eisenhower in the Middle East backed the British and French out of Egypt with a very interesting observation. And it sounds so trite, it's hard to believe. But he said the era of colonialism is over. And let me tell you, Dwight David Eisenhower was immensely respected in the Middle East. We as a citizenry have a responsibility to assess our policies. And when I talk about what ifs, it's with great sorrow. But by the way, Eisenhower used troops intrusively once, and that is he sent 1,000 of our crack troops, the 101st Airborne, to Little Rock, Arkansas, to see that 7 little kids could enter a school. And that is, you've all heard about the Powell Doctrine, which is every couple generations some military leader somewhere argues overwhelming force doctrine. And in the first Gulf War, it was identified with Colin Powell. Well, that was Ike internally. It was also Ike in World War II. The Russians were very upset that we took so long to invade Europe. And everybody kind of knows that Ike was waiting for enough landing craft, but it was much more than that. He was waiting for supplies that he could push into Europe once the landing occurred. And he was an overwhelming force trained military leader, and he applied common sense logic to American public life. And I just think that it's worthy now and again to think about success stories in America too. Yes, sir.
In talking about this with other folks, I've heard comments. The one that keeps coming to my mind is ethics is no longer important for business or accounting or something like that. And I'm just curious as to if you think there's a substantive difference between 30 and 40 years ago, the role of the humanities and the role that the humanities now has to play, or if it's a similar role or if it's
Well, I think ethical issues always exist, and sometimes it's the nature of a system, and sometimes it really speaks well to us. I mean, for example, if I will tell you there's very little corruption in American politics. I don't know about all the cities in Rhode Island, but there is a huge amount of conflicts of interest that have been legalized. And one of the ethics issues that ought to be discussed is what is the meaning of a conflict of interest? And there is no such thing, as Bob will tell you, a member of Congress believing that campaign contributions have affected their vote. Well, you look at the dollars that come in, and most congressmen, well, legally a congressman can't use these dollars to put their son through college. or buy a house, but it's to preserve a job. And most people in public life think that they are deserving of that job, and because the other person is raising a lot of money, they should too. But the fact of the matter is, one becomes quite indebted to large amounts of money. And the United States Supreme Court that did not look at human nature when it made a ruling called Citizens United has exacerbated this problem dramatically. And this is a great ethical problem. Now, in our system, in private capitalism, because you've talked about business, the profit motive is a driving force. But interestingly, competition holds it in check. If I want to sell you this microphone, I'd like to sell it at a really high price, but if around the corner you can get it at a lower price, I'm blocked. And so competition stops me from being too greedy in many circumstances. The first poetic eulogy to communism in the 17th century, a poet named Mandeville, who had a famous line, "These are the blessings of the state, their crimes conspire to make them great." And what he meant by crimes was following self-interest. So there are aspects of human nature that come into how you get to an honest system. And there are aspects of judgment that come into historical review, and that is that socialized systems sometimes can be exceptionally corrupt, although there are some examples where they're not. I mean, Sweden is not a corrupt society, but many concentrated decision-making countries are. And so we have laws that are can hold people accountable. The American public is disenchanted in this banking crisis or banking/housing crisis of 2007 through 10 that perhaps fair accountability wasn't wrought. Those bringing that accountability argue that they don't say this publicly, traded dollars for years in prison. And virtually every major institution would rather give up somebody else's treasure, that is their shareholders' treasure, than go to jail. And so that was kind of the compromise. And so you're getting some huge financial settlements without anyone going to jail, or very few. And the public is dissatisfied with that. But basically speaking, we have a surprise or a more honest business system than today's kind of attitude might suggest, and it's all because it's principally because competition holds down excesses, and then the legal system is very precise. For example, in politics, widely unseen by the public, if Bob is your congressman and accepted a $500 bribe, the penalty is just as great if it was a $5 million bribe. I mean, we don't tolerate bribes. And that's terrific. And lots of societies, small bribes are totally tolerated, and then it's really hard to keep in check. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that one of the fundamental problems underlying the current situation is a failure to understand the difference between the cost of something and the value of something, right? So in this political climate, when everybody's bottom line seems to be the bottom line, how do you chip away at that? How do you try to change politicians' views?
Well, how do you chip away and change politics? If you remember, Bill Clinton had a phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." Actually, today in politics, it's the primary process, stupid. And if one wants to change, one really has to dig very deeply into the primary process. And if you believe one political party has more difficulty than another today, that's an interesting argument to join that party, which might sound bizarre. But the math is such, and I sometimes talk about American politics in a mathematical way. If you take the last generation of American politics, we've been about a third Democratic, a third Republican, a third no party. Now, it isn't just that today. But if you take that as a scenario, that means that half of a third, if you're mathematical at all, maybe the president will help you, is 1/6. So 1/6 of the American people control the Republican Party, 1/6 control the Democratic Party. But if 1 in 4 eligible voters participate in primaries, and it's often 1 in 8, 1 in 12, but let's say it's a big primary, 1 in 4 participate, that means it's 1/4 times 1/6. So 1/24 of the American people control the Republican Party, 1/24 the Democratic. And by the way, it's often 1/48 or less that control these parties in various states. Well, then you ask yourself, who is the 1/24th? Because the 1/24th control the vote in a primary. And on the Democratic side, it's been kind of a stable, relatively liberal group of teachers, union leaders, and the academy, and others. In the Republican Party, it's been quite conservative, but it used to be Barry Goldwater conservatism. Now it's kind of a social conservative. Barry Goldwater would be a very liberal Republican today. But if you don't like that, all you have to do is organize all your neighbors and try to participate. But I'll give you an even more extraordinary phenomenon. The political parties in the old day, if you were writing in political science, had a lot to do with the party structure. Who controls the county committee, the state committee, the national committees of both parties? And I will tell you, the percentage of people that participate in a county Republican or Democratic Party gathering is less than probably 100th or maybe 1,000th of 1%. And what it means is that very small numbers of people can take over a political party. Now, in the old day in my state, in the Midwest, the Republican Party was a little bit of a natural leadership grouping, the largest farmers, the so-called country club set, business people, etc. Now it's largely come from churches. And when groups change, what happens is new people come into political parties, but old people walk out. And so you have this interesting transition that people change their allegiances. And then no one is thinking about it. If you have a society that every year becomes more complicated, the number of issues that are potentially political are just sensational. How conceivably can one political party capture all your thoughts? And so everybody in this room, whatever party they're in, has to be objecting like mad to some of their party's stances, whatever they might be. And to me, that leads to the obvious circumstance that maybe the two parties ought to talk more, because sometimes a Democrat should vote with the Republicans, sometimes a Republican should vote with the Democrats, because the issues change. And then they're not only issues changing, there are dichotomies between these issues. There's a difference between foreign policy and domestic policy. There's a difference between economic policy and social policy. Unfortunately, we've entered a world in which there kind of a clubbishness that many in public life, particularly at the highest levels in Washington, more so than at local levels, more so than legislatures at the state level, although also there too, that there's a little more back and forth. And Washington is setting a kind of model that is out of step with the communities in which people are elected from. And it is a truly unusual circumstance. And so one of the great questions is, does the public want to come and take charge? Now, in 50 states, I've given talks on the subject of civility. And I mentioned to someone at dinner, a friend of mine who's a professor at the University of South Carolina on a MacArthur Fellowship, had written a book about one word. And the word was reconciliation, and it's the story of the South African transition from apartheid to a quasi-democratic system. And he argues that at one point, one of the leaders of one of the sides uttered the word reconciliation and didn't mean it at all, hated the other side, didn't want to have reconciliation. But the other side repeated it, and they didn't mean it, and then suddenly it started to get repeated, and suddenly the word captured kind of resonance, and the society moved in a new direction. Well, as trite as it is, I think the word civility is the closest we're going to come in our society, and that we ought to be saying to people, think about it, guys. Think about it. Act upon it. And maybe some sort of change will come about. Now the confusing aspect, and it is so terrifying I can't tell you, is the other dimension of American politics is called money. And now to get money in one side, one has to be pretty perfect to one set of groups. To get money on the other side, one has to be pretty perfect. And if you want to take Congress of the United States, approximately 85% of all seats are safe for one party or the other. And it's about split between about half of these are safe seat Democratic, half Republican. But what that means is that if one represents a Democratic seat that's a safe seat, one's great jeopardy of job is to vote with a Republican and to be a moderate, because for sure someone will come along and say, we need a real Democrat, a real liberal to represent this seat. And the liability is in the primary. And on the Republican side, it's even bigger. And on the Republican side, lots of money comes with it. If there is such a thing as a moderate Republican today who votes in a more moderate direction, there are a group of people that might well come in with $1 million or $2 million to win a primary, to throw that person out. And that is truly worth thinking about, and there ought to be a revolution in this society about the influence of money in politics. And I will tell you, there is no such thing as a representative who will ever say they are influenced by money, and there's no such thing as a member who say they're apprehensive about something. But if you believe in human nature, it really, really influences how people act and how they vote. Now, if you don't believe in human nature, everything I say is wrong. We'll make this the last one. Go ahead.
I'm curious about an element of the situation you haven't touched upon, and that's the consumers, the students in the students in the academic world. Where does their desire for a certain kind of education come into this discussion?
Well, as everybody in every part of the academy knows, parents are playing a role, and there is a lot of pressure on students. And right now, one of the great thought processes going along in the American family are that certain things are more job-centric than others. Now, there are studies out there that liberal arts graduates do very well. There are studies out there that indicate that corporate CEOs would prefer someone to have a humanities major and then maybe go to business school. Now, what does the academy do? I mean, one thing is how every university looks at its own requirements for graduation. Very interesting phenomenon. And how does it look at requirements for professional schools? And so, to me, I personally think if one is going to be an undergraduate business major, now the largest major in most state universities is undergraduate business school. There ought to be a really strong requirement for also taking some humanities subjects. And that's not a humanities major, but it's subjects. And personally, I think it wouldn't be unwise to put a lot of emphasis on having a minor. But those are decisions that universities have to make. And coming from a public policy background, maybe I am disproportionately oriented and concerned about citizenship, which, by the way, in 19th, 18th century, people thought was this aspect of university training, was citizenship. I mean, part of it being people who went to universities were the leaders of their countries. A very small percentage went. Now you have huge percentages of people that go to universities, but this is a democracy. And I think people should get a taste for citizenship values. And I don't think they're taught with someone being told they have to know how many electoral votes Rhode Island has versus New York. But I do think that people should have a sense for American history in one way or another. And I also think history is taught through literature, that you get a sense for the times. And if you, all these little phrases I mentioned in this statement of mine, there's a lot to be garnered there. But no school should do anything except be proud of its STEM subjects too. But I use the phrase, as I did tonight, about there are myths out there too. And there are myths about the job orientation of a liberal arts major. And I personally think if you're thinking of leading a business, it's inconceivable not to have some humanities training. And that doesn't mean that an engineer might not lead a business, but it's good for that engineer to have a little background. Now, as someone that spent some time in politics, I don't consider it a trade discipline. I never took a course in American political life. I think that's something that's a little more osmosis than many might. But I do think that the field of politics is a very interesting field, covering everything from political philosophy to international relations to basically history related to political judgments. And those are all very interesting fields and of interest that should be probed. And I don't think they should be dictated by a Congress which might not want to be looked at too carefully. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was very filled with wisdom, and we appreciate your presence and your guidance. We have a full slate of events tomorrow, beginning with faculty talks in Swan Hall Hoffman Room from 10 until 3 with a lunch break. And then we have 2 performance events back here tomorrow evening. The first is called Triple Decker, written and will be narrated by Mark Levitt and his partner Valerie Tutson at 3:30. And then at 5 o'clock, we're going to be very happy to have Bill Harley talking and singing, I believe, at 5 o'clock here. And Bill is right here, and we've been so happy to have you this evening, and his partner and wife, Debbie. So we have much to look forward to tomorrow. Have a good evening. Hang around. There are books on the table to look at written by URI faculty authors. And thanks. Isaac and Rachel are Humanities and Arts alumni. Thank you for that great panel today. That was just terrific. We're going to be sure to get that up somehow, that video, and maybe some print as well. And Jonathan, who had to leave. So thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you, Chairman.